Chapter 1. Autumn in Altai. Last autumn, the Altai mountains seemed to gather a peculiar strength. The rarefied mountain air filled with the first snowflakes, which, like tiny white moths, silently swirled in the gray sky. The austere slopes, dotted with yellow and russet patches of half-dried grass, appeared both somber and majestic. This grandeur didn't intimidate, but rather inspired a reverent awe, especially in those unprepared for the whims of mountain weather. In a small village nestled at the very foot of these mountains lived a 12-year-old girl named Aina. Tall for her age, with dark braids, she always wore simple clothes. A warm, padded jacket, trousers, and old boots, hand-me-downs, from her older cousin. Her eyes, large and expressive, spoke of a character that was both vulnerable and resilient. Her father had left the family several years ago and hadn't been heard from since. Her mother, to provide for herself and her daughter, toiled from dawn till dusk in the fields, returning home weary and withdrawn. So, Aina had to grow up in solitude, finding meaning in each new day on her own. The only person who had ever unveiled to her the beauty and secrets of the mountains was her grandfather. He often told stories of the Altai's wondrous inhabitants, of mighty snow leopards and rare golden eagles, of regal red deer, but most of all about the manul, a reclusive mountain cat with thick fur and eyes like yellow coins. According to her grandfather, manuls led solitary lives and could vanish like mist if they sensed even the slightest danger. After her grandfather passed away, Aina kept his stories in her heart. Every spare moment she spent in the mountains, sketching imaginary manuals on scraps of paper. These drawings were uneven, clumsy, yet they possessed a special soul. The paws came out soft, the eyes round and enigmatic, and the tails fluffy, as if specially designed for the cold winds. She believed that one day she would be lucky enough to encounter a real manul. And although almost all the locals smiled at her dreams with good-natured condescension, Aina herself never wavered from her cherished desire. At the same time, in a rocky gorge high above the village and far from human eyes, lived a solitary manul cat. The shadows of the cliffs were his home, the wind and stones his companions, and small rodents like voles and picas became his primary prey. Unlike ordinary domestic cats, this wild cat was larger, with a stocky body and dense fur that protected him from the piercing cold. He roamed the narrow stone passages and secret trails, sometimes approaching the village boundaries as the thick evening light fell, but always keeping his distance from people. Humans had never petted him, never given him a name, and only chance could bring the manul and the human together in such a way that they could truly see each other, not just in a glance but into the depths of their souls. Chapter 2. Aina's backstory. Aina was born in this small Altai village and had grown accustomed to hardship since childhood. Life here was harsh. A short summer gifted a little warmth, while winter dragged on for many months. When it got particularly cold, snow buried everything around. Roads disappeared and communication with neighboring villages was lost. Aina's mother had to rise with the first rays of the sun and go to work, harvesting crops, chopping firewood, helping with haymaking for the horses and cows owned by wealthier neighbors. The pay was meager, but in this remote region there were practically no other options. At school, Aina was a mediocre student, not because she was lazy, but rather because she was perpetually lost in her own thoughts, dreams, and drawings. Sometimes teachers grumbled that she was gazing at the stars, forgetting about real life. But the girl thought differently. The mountains that surrounded her village seemed better than any book. Stones, trees, soft moss pushing through crevices, streams with crystal clear water. All this nature seemed to call out to her, bestowing a sense of freedom and security. When no one was around, Aina could sit for hours on a rock ledge, gazing into the distance, imagining that a whole world of adventures lay hidden beyond the next ridge. In her spare time, of which she had little, the girl helped her mother around the house, washing clothes in the cold river water, carrying firewood, cleaning the yard. But every time she had a chance, she would grab her pencils and run out of the house to seek inspiration in the surrounding nature. Thus, On scraps of tattered paper, her manuals, bears, wolves, and even fantastical creatures like mountain spirits, which Aina knew from folk tales, were born. Her father, according to rumors, had once left to find work in another region, but never returned, never sent a single letter. The girl only sometimes saw him in her dreams, and then for a long time couldn't shake off the feeling of longing for her lost family. But it was precisely because of this loneliness that she became deeply attached to every word her grandfather had managed to tell her. Especially deeply rooted in her heart were his stories about manuls, invisible guardians of the mountains. To see a manul is like touching the very mystery of nature. She would repeat his words, trying to sense the majesty of these creatures. Chapter 3. The Manul's Backstory. Tuman. The Manul that Aina dreamed of had actually long resided in those mountains. He had no name, of course, as wild animals do not know human words, but every creature in nature has its own story, often wordless, but no less profound. This Manul was no longer young, but not quite old either. Once, he had a mate with whom he had weathered several harsh winters. Together, they hunted pikas and small rodents, hid in rock crevices from snowstorms and blizzards. But one particularly fierce winter, his partner couldn't escape from a snowdrift that had collapsed, blocking the exit from their den. The Manul waited for her for several days, scratching at the frozen crust with his claws, but his strength was too little. Ultimately, he was left alone, and this loss made him even more cautious and withdrawn. The caution that the Manul had already shown at every sound and at the sight of every human silhouette intensified many times over. Now he tried not to approach places where there might be a scent of human dwelling or even just a rarely trodden path. He chose the most rocky areas, climbing as high as possible, where only the wind and rare eagles could spot him. His diet was meager, but he knew how to endure hunger and cold, and when it became completely unbearable, he would descend a little closer to the village to find voles in the outskirts or to seek refuge in an abandoned structure for a rest. However, in this Manul, despite all his somber independence, a spark of curiosity flickered. At times, especially on warm evenings, he could watch the distant lights coming from village windows, as if seeking their reflection in the dark sky. It seemed he sensed that humans were creatures not of his world, but there was something mysterious and alluring in them, unlike the familiar rhythm of the mountains and snow. Chapter 4. An event uniting the characters. One such autumn day, Aina's mother asked her to go and collect brushwood. Dry branches were always in demand. They were used to heat the stove, sometimes used to fence off a small enclosure for livestock. The girl didn't object. A trip to the mountains promised her a little freedom and an opportunity to at least furtively try to glimpse the fluffy mountain cat in the gorges. However, the weather in the mountains is capricious. The morning had been sunny, but closer to noon, a whitish shroud of fog descended from the peaks. It would thicken and roll in clouds, then suddenly dissipate, giving a fleeting respite. Aina, busy collecting dry branches and admiring the scenery, didn't immediately notice how the thick fog had completely enveloped the path back. When she realized it was time to return, it became clear that the landmarks had vanished and visibility had reduced to almost zero. Her steps became labored, the cold seeped through her clothes, and fear gradually began to dominate her thoughts. Moreover, the wind began to howl, foretelling the approach of bad weather. She called out loudly for her mother and the villagers several times, but only emptiness answered. Trying not to panic, the girl began to look for tracks on the ground, but wet stones and decaying leaves concealed them. And then, in one particularly bleak moment, when it seemed to her that there was no hope, she noticed someone's gleaming eyes in the distance. It was the Manul. Aina froze, her heart pounding as if trying to break free from her chest. At first, she thought it might be a wolf or some other dangerous beast, and she grew even colder than from the damp fog. But peering closer, she recognized the characteristic features: a short nose, a bushy muzzle, round ears. "Manul," she whispered, as if afraid to startle an apparition. "A real one." The cat sat nearby, blending in with the gray stones. His eyes were indeed yellow, like coins, and gleamed in the damp air. It seemed he was studying Aina, assessing. Was she dangerous? Aina stopped crying. She suddenly felt calmer from the awareness that she was not alone. Let it be a wild beast before her, but it wasn't in a hurry to attack and wasn't running away. Chapter 5. Developing relationship. Understanding that the Manul might flee at a sudden movement, Aina carefully sat down on the wet grass, placed the brushwood beside her, and spoke quietly, trying to soothe both herself and the animal with her voice. Hello, I'm Aina. I think we're both lost. You're probably used to this kind of weather, but I'm not. But let's just stay close by. I won't do you any harm. The Manul continued to watch her warily, but in his gaze there was no overt aggression, more like curiosity. Aina rummaged in her pocket and found a small piece of bread that was left over from breakfast. She placed it on the ground in front of her, stepping back a pace. The cat, sensing the scent of unfamiliar food, approached and cautiously took the bread, all the while glancing at the girl. Eat, if you want. I don't mind sharing. I'll name you Tuman, she whispered, smiling slightly. Because you appeared so suddenly, like the fog that has covered these mountains. Her words, of course, could not be understood by the Manul literally, but the sound of her voice and the soft intonation, apparently, did not frighten the beast. Having eaten a little, the cat moved aside, continuing to observe Aina. The fog would disappear in a whitish haze, then reappear before her eyes. The girl felt a strange calm. There was someone alive nearby, someone who was also alone in this harsh world. Evening fell, and it grew even colder in the mountains. The fog veil was no longer enough to conceal the onset of darkness. Aina needed to find shelter, otherwise she might freeze. Noticing that Tuman had begun to move away somewhere along a rocky ridge, the girl risked following him, as if in tacit agreement, relying on his instincts. And indeed, after some time, he led her to a shallow crevice that protected her from the direct wind and allowed her to warm up a little. They spent the night close by, Aina shivering and periodically waking up through a few branches she had managed to collect beforehand into a small fire. Tuman lay a little distance away, curled up in a ball, sometimes glancing in her direction with his huge eyes. Towards morning, the girl, tired and chilled to the bone, fell into a powerless sleep. Waking up, she saw that the cat was still nearby. Chapter 6. Trials. Hunger, cold, and dangers. Morning greeted them with an unexpected worsening of the weather. Due to temperature fluctuations in the mountains, it began to snow. Snowflakes covered the ground in an uneven layer, and a strong wind intensified the feeling of cold. Aina understood that she needed to return to the village as soon as possible, but she had no idea which way to go. The entire familiar path was hidden by fog and snowdrifts. She had almost no strength left. Overnight, she had only slightly nibbled on the remnants of bread, and there was no hot food. Tuman, driven by either curiosity or compassion, did not leave her for long. Sometimes he would disappear into the fog, and then return again. It seemed he was checking if this strange human girl was still there. Aina was cold, and she grew quiet, sinking into a semi-conscious state. But one day, the cat returned not with empty paws. In his teeth, he held a small mountain vole. It looked pitiful, but in the harsh conditions of survival, Aina had no choice. She understood that if she didn't eat anything, she simply wouldn't endure. Somehow gathering her strength, she lit a fire from the remaining branches and tinder of dry pine needles and roasted the vole. The smell was unpleasant, but the warmth of the food gave her a tiny spark of life. "Thank you, Tuman," Aina whispered, watching as the cat sat opposite her, observing the process. "Sorry, I don't know how to hunt myself." Tuman could not answer, but his ears twitched. He stood up and approached Aina, as if checking if she was all right. This short scene showed that the wild beast was ready to share with a human what he had, albeit out of his natural instincts. The girl was deeply touched by such an act. But the trials did not end there. At night, the weather worsened even more, and the snowfall turned into a real blizzard. The wind howled like a pack of wolves, and white flakes flew into her face, stinging her skin, making it impossible to move. Aina and Tuman took shelter in a small cave. which the Manul apparently knew beforehand. But the silence did not last long. At some point, the silhouette of a large predator appeared at the entrance to the cave. A wolf entered, having caught the scent of a human and a Manul, and apparently considered that he had found easy prey. Aina's heart constricted with horror. She understood that she had practically no chance against a huge wolf. But Tuman unexpectedly began to hiss loudly, bared his claws, and leaped towards the predator, making sharp sounds, more like hissing and growling at the same time. The wolf recoiled in surprise, receiving a painful blow to the muzzle with claws. The Manul did not let go, scratching, biting, and showing a furious courage uncharacteristic of cats. Finally, the wolf, bewildered and wounded, preferred to retreat, losing interest in such a fierce victim. Aina, trembling with fear and cold, rushed to Tuman, seeing that he was limping and the fur on his paw was stained with blood. She carefully tried to touch his paw to examine the wound, but the Manul growled softly, letting her know that contact was unpleasant and painful. Nevertheless, he did not run away. Apparently, his strength was also running out. The girl found a scrap of clean cloth in her meager backpack and, wetting it with melted snow, carefully pressed it to the wound. Tuman endured the procedure and then curled up nearby, still hissing slightly, but not protesting. Chapter 7. Climax. Aina's choice. After this terrifying night, Aina realized that staying in the cave any longer was dangerous. Food was running out and brushwood too. The girl understood. If she didn't get out to people, she would perish. But no less important was that she didn't want to abandon the wounded Manul. He had saved her life, and now he needed help no less than she did herself. For some time, Aina considered whether to try to lead Tuman to the village herself. But as soon as she imagined that people there might be frightened of the wild cat or even harm him, everything inside her contracted. Besides, walking through snow-covered paths with a wounded animal in her arms was almost impossible. Even a healthy Manul would be impossible to drag to the village. He would break free. And Tuman himself was unlikely to voluntarily allow himself to be carried like a domestic kitten. Aina sat in the depths of the cave, clutching the remnants of her clothing to herself to keep warm at least a little. Tuman lay nearby, breathing heavily, but gradually coming to his senses. The girl felt that they were connected by some invisible thread of friendship, caused by shared misfortune and mutual help. And suddenly, she noticed that the Manul was slowly but resolutely getting to his feet. "Where are you going?" she asked quietly, understanding that the cat would not answer. The Manul seemed to look her straight in the eyes. His yellow pupils glimmered in the semi-darkness of the cave. Then he slowly, limping, moved towards the exit. Aina, pursing her lips, didn't stop him. Maybe he needs to hunt, she thought, or find a safe place. After all, it's a wild beast. He has his own path. But in fact, Tuman left not to hunt at all. A little later, Aina would understand that he had gone for help, although he was not aware of the human meaning of this word. The Manul knew where the village was approximately located. He could smell the smoke, hear the distant barking of dogs at night. Perhaps, in his head, there was only one intention: to lead people away from himself, but at the same time show them the place where the girl needed rescue. A combination of caution and a desire to help, a rare thing even for humans, let alone for a wild beast, seems like a miracle. But sometimes miracles do happen. Chapter 8. Resolution. Rescue. Several hours passed, and the snowfall subsided. Aina, already almost losing consciousness, lay on the cold stone floor of the cave, periodically freezing from the cold. At some point, it seemed to her that she heard human voices. At first, she decided it was a hallucination, but the voices grew closer, and suddenly, beams of lanterns and the voices of villagers burst into the cave entrance. "She's here!" someone familiar shouted. "Quick, help!" It was Aina's mother and neighbors, who had been combing the mountains for the second day in attempts to find the girl. They had found her thanks to the strange tracks of the Manul, which lay closer to the edge of the forest and then abruptly disappeared. One of the hunters, looking closely, decided to check every crevice. And so, fortunately, he discovered the girl, almost powerless, but alive. Aina's mother rushed to her, hugged her, wrapped her in a warm blanket. The girl was carried out of the cave in their arms, given warm drinks. Someone was examining her wounds, frostbite. Tears streamed down her mother's face as she thanked everyone who had helped in the search. Aina, in a semi-conscious state, managed to utter a few words. Tuman, cat, he, saved. And then she passed out again. When they returned to the village, Aina was warmed up, given hot broth to drink, and examined by a paramedic to make sure there would be no serious health consequences. No one knew about the Manul, and the girl didn't begin to tell the story in detail until she fully recovered. But in her heart, there was a longing for her fluffy savior, who, risking his own life, had protected her and led people to her. Chapter 9. Epilogue. Memory and Promise. Weeks passed. Aina was recovering, and every evening she tried to go outside, look towards the mountains, hoping to see yellow eyes again in the dark gloom. But Tuman never appeared near the village. Maybe he was wandering nearby, but hiding, not wanting to encounter people again. Maybe he had gone high into the mountains, where snow and wind more reliably sheltered his wild heart. The girl could only guess. However, one frosty morning, when ringing silence enveloped the village houses, Aina went out onto the porch and saw a pair of round cat tracks on the fresh snow cover. They led to the outskirts of the village and then disappeared among the stones. The girl could not be mistaken. These were Manul tracks. Perhaps Tuman had come to check on her. Perhaps he was just looking for rodents nearby. But the fact remained. He had returned, albeit for a short time. That same night, Aina had a dream, as if she was lost again, but now standing not in cold fog, but in a sunlit meadow. Tuman slowly approached her, and his eyes were full of peace. She reached out her hand, and this time he allowed her to touch his fur without growling. The dream was so vivid that upon waking, Aina still felt the taste of mountain air in her mouth. She took a clean sheet of paper and began to draw. First, she outlined the contours of the mountains, then wrapped them in a white snow cover, added sharp lines of cliffs. In the center of the drawing, she placed a human figure, a girl in heavy boots and a padded jacket. Nearby, slightly to the side, the silhouette of a fluffy cat with keen yellow eyes. With careful strokes, Aina depicted his fur, giving each hair individuality. When the drawing was finished, she felt her heart beat faster. In this drawing, she seemed to reconnect their paths, hers and Tuman's. Over time, Aina began to draw more and more Manuls, solitary, paired, in motion and at rest. For her, it was not just a hobby. It became a goal, a very real dream that inspired her to further actions. She vowed to herself that when she grew up, she would become an artist or a zoologist, to study wild cats and help preserve their habitat. The old resentment and pain of loss, because of her father, because of her mother's constant work, gradually dissolved in a new feeling of freedom that her encounter with the Manul had given her. When she turned 15, Aina indeed went to study at an art school in the nearest town, and then returned to her native village as a grown-up girl. Her paintings of Manuls, wolves and snow leopards became known in the district. People began to treat mountain cats with greater respect, having learned that such amazing creatures could live next to them. And Aina invariably kept in her heart the memory of that wild cat who had once given her a chance for salvation. As for Tuman, different rumors circulated about him. Some said they had seen his tracks near the cave. Others claimed to have heard a strange hissing in the night. And one of the hunters swore that while hunting in the mountains, he had seen a fleeting fluffy shadow that seemed to be watching people from a respectful distance. No one knew for sure if he was still alive, but Aina believed that Tuman remained somewhere in his native mountains, strong, proud, eternally solitary guardian of the rocky peaks. Every time she came to the foot of the mountains, she would quietly say, "Tuman, I'm back." And sometimes it seemed to her that she heard a faint echo in response, like a distant purring. Maybe it was just the play of the wind, or maybe a greeting from one of the most mysterious and beautiful animals of Altai. Such is the heart-wrenching story of how an ordinary village girl named Aina and a wild mountain cat Manul given the name Tuman by her, collided in the harsh conditions of the Altai Mountains last autumn. Their meeting was not accidental. It became a symbol that nature and humans can find common ground, even if separated by fears, prejudices, and different languages. In the cold fog and snowstorm, they both felt the depth of their loneliness and understood that in this vast world, everyone needs support. Tuman, accustomed to surviving in rocky crevices, and Aina, living in a poor village and yearning for a miracle, found something important in each other. Who knows, maybe it was the Manul who saved her life, and the girl, in return, gave this wild animal a sense that kindness and compassion exist in the world, even if you are used to seeing only a threat in humans. The story of their joint survival and subsequent parting reminds us that sometimes the strongest bonds are created in extreme situations. Aina, returning home, not only gained a new purpose in life, but also realized how deep friendship can be between humans and wildlife. She preserved her childhood sincerity and the ability to look at the world with wide open eyes, and her drawings of Manuls became a reminder that miracles happen where we least expect them.